He walked onto her family's dock like he owned it, because in his mind, he already did. Tanner Doyle stood at the edge of the weathered planks, one hand resting on Presley Marsh's lower back, his sunglasses catching the late afternoon glare off the water. He didn't flinch when Harper's car turned up the gravel drive. He didn't step away from Presley. He just turned, looked at his wife of 11 years, and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're not my wife anymore." Not a whisper. Not a private moment. A declaration, with witnesses. If this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Leave a like, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the dock, because Harper Doyle wasn't finished yet. The call came on a Wednesday morning, which was the kind of detail Harper would remember for the rest of her life. Not because Wednesdays meant anything particular to her, but because she'd been doing something so ordinary when her phone rang. She was standing in the kitchen of her rental apartment in Asheville, waiting for coffee to finish brewing, still in the oversized flannel shirt she'd slept in, her hair not yet brushed. She'd been thinking about groceries, whether she needed more olive oil, whether she should finally call her dentist about the appointment she'd pushed back twice. Then her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize, a local area code from Calder's Bend, the small lakeside town where she'd grown up, 3 hours east. She almost let it go to voicemail. "Is this Harper Doyle?" The woman's voice was careful, the kind of careful that people use when they're about to deliver bad news, and they've thought about how to do it. "It is," Harper said. "My name is Ruth Ann Pickett. I live just down the road from your family's property on Calder Lake. I don't know if this is my business or not, but..." A pause. "There are people moving things into your parents' house. I saw a moving truck this morning, and I recognized your husband's car in the driveway." Harper set down her coffee mug. "I'm sorry?" "Tanner Doyle, that's your husband, isn't it? I remember seeing him at your mother's funeral. I didn't know if you knew. I didn't want to call if it was nothing." "No," Harper said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You were right to call. Thank you, Ruth Ann." She hung up and stood there for a moment in the kitchen, in the flannel shirt, in the ordinary Wednesday morning light, and felt the floor tilt slightly under her feet. She and Tanner had been separated for 4 months. Not legally. They hadn't filed anything yet, hadn't sat across from lawyers, hadn't divided anything up on paper. It had been one of those separations that happened slowly and then all at once. The silences that stretched too long, the business trips that ran together. The evening she came home and found his closet half emptied without a conversation, without a note, and understood that this was how it was going to be. He'd moved into a downtown Asheville condo he'd apparently been renting for some time. She'd stayed in the house they shared, then couldn't stand it, then found the rental apartment near the river. They'd spoken maybe 6 times since, texts, mostly. Brief and careful, and nothing like two people who had once stood at an altar and meant it. Her parents' lake house had not come up. Not once. The drive to Calder's Bend took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Harper didn't stop. She drove with the windows down because the air conditioning made a sound that bothered her, and she hadn't gotten it fixed. And she thought about her parents the whole way. Her father Gerald, who had died 3 years ago in March, and her mother Vivian, who had followed him 18 months later, as though she'd simply decided she'd rather be where he was. Harper had scattered their ashes off the dock together, in the gold evening light, with no one else there because there wasn't anyone else. No siblings, no extended family left to speak of. Just her. The lake house had been in her father's family since the 1940s. It was not a grand place. It had 4 bedrooms and a screened porch and a dock that needed new boards every few years. And the kitchen faucet had dripped for as long as Harper could remember. Her parents had never wanted to fix it. Her mother used to say the sound of it was company. Harper had found that irritating for most of her childhood. And then, somewhere in her 30s, had started to understand what her mother meant. When she turned down the long gravel road through the pines, she could already see the moving truck. It was a big white rental, parked crookedly in the turnaround in front of the house. 2 men were carrying a box spring up the porch steps. Harper parked behind the truck and got out of her car. Her mother's fern baskets still hung on either side of the front door, though they were dry and brown now from neglect. Someone had propped the screen door open with a brick. The furniture on the porch, her parents' old wicker chairs, her mother's reading table, had been pushed to one side to make room for stacked boxes. And in one of those wicker chairs, with her legs crossed and a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand, sat a woman Harper recognized immediately. Meredith Doyle, Tanner's mother. She was wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat that Harper had bought for her own mother 3 summers ago, a pale blue hat with a ribbon, purchased from a shop in Asheville because Vivian had admired it in a magazine. Harper recognized it the way you recognize something that belongs to you. The hat sat on Meredith's head like she'd always owned it. "Well," Meredith said, not moving, "you made good time." Harper stopped at the base of the porch steps. "Where's Tanner?" "Down at the dock." Meredith reached up and adjusted the brim of the hat. "You should know, Harper, this isn't personal. It's practical." "That hat belonged to my mother." Meredith looked at her for a moment, then back out at the yard. "She doesn't need it anymore." Harper walked around the side of the house without another word. The path to the dock wound through a stand of old white oaks, whose roots had buckled the ground over the decades into familiar, specific shapes that Harper had been navigating since she was small. She knew which root to step over and which way to go when the path split near the storage shed. She walked quickly, not running, and came out through the tree line onto the narrow strip of grass that led to the dock. Tanner was standing near the end of it. He had his back to her, looking out over the water, and for just a moment she thought of how many times she'd watched him stand exactly like that particular posture, shoulders relaxed, hands loose at his sides, and felt something that used to be love. It had taken her a long time to understand that what she'd loved was the idea of him, the version of Tanner Doyle he presented when he was trying. The woman standing next to him turned first. Presley Marsh was 31 years old and worked, officially, as Tanner's executive assistant at Doyle Capital Partners, the real estate investment firm he'd built in the years after their marriage. Harper had met her twice at company events. Both times, Tanner had been too attentive in the way men are when they're trying to look inattentive. Harper had filed it away and not examined it, which she now understood said something about the survival instincts you develop when you're not ready to know the truth yet. Presley saw her coming and put her hand on Tanner's arm. He turned. He looked, Harper thought, like a man who had prepared for this moment and was disappointed it wasn't going differently. He had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He always did that when he was trying to appear casual. "I was wearing a linen shirt she didn't recognize. He'd bought new clothes." "Harper." He said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. "Tanner." She stopped at the foot of the dock. The boards were weathered gray, the same as always. The water moved underneath. "You want to explain what's happening?" "I think you can see what's happening." "I want to hear you say it." Presley shifted her weight slightly. Neither of them looked comfortable, exactly, but Tanner was better at performing composure than most people Harper knew. It was one of his genuine skills. "The firm needed a satellite location," he said. "This property has been sitting empty for over a year. It made sense to use it." "It made sense," Harper repeated. "Yes. It made sense to move a truck to my family's property, bring your—" She paused, chose the word carefully. "Assistant, move your mother in, and not say one word to me about it." "We're separated, Harper." "We're not divorced, Tanner." Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt. She'd stopped expecting guilt a long time ago. It was more like calculation, like watching a man decide which card to play. He glanced once at Presley, then back at Harper, and when he spoke again his voice had gone flat, in a way she recognized as his version of certainty. "You're not my wife anymore." It landed the way he meant it to. She could feel it. There were 2 men from the moving company still carrying things around the side of the house. Meredith, somewhere behind her on the porch. Presley standing close enough to Tanner that their arms nearly touched. Harper looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Presley. She looked at the water, the lake she'd grown up swimming in, the dock her father had built and rebuilt and loved. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. "Harper." Tanner's voice followed her. "We should talk about this like adults." She didn't answer. She came up through the side yard, past the old storage shed with the broken latch her father had never fixed, past the oak tree with the rusted hook where they used to hang a bird feeder. The 2 movers were coming down the porch steps as she went up. She held the screen door and walked inside. The house smelled different. Someone had sprayed something, an air freshener, something synthetic and vaguely floral, and it sat on top of the deeper smell of old wood and lake air, and the particular mustiness of a house that had been closed up for seasons. It offended Harper in a way that surprised her with its sharpness. It was such a small thing, and it made her angrier than almost anything else she'd seen in the last 20 minutes. Boxes were stacked in the living room. Some of her parents' things had been moved. Her mother's lamp from beside the reading chair was sitting on the floor in the hallway, unplugged. The bookshelf had been partially cleared. Meredith appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, still holding her iced tea. "There are things we should sort through," she said. "I noticed some of Vivian's items in the closets. We can donate what you don't want." Harper turned and looked at her. "Get out of this house." "Harper, I'm not asking. Get off the property." Meredith's expression tightened into something prim and wounded, which was her default when she felt she wasn't being properly deferred to. "Tanner has every right. Tanner has no rights to this property." Harper's voice was quiet. She was surprised by how quiet it was. "My father established a family trust before he died. This house and the surrounding land belong to the Doyle Family Preservation Trust, and I am the sole trustee. Tanner's name is not on any document associated with this property. Not a deed, not a lease, nothing." She paused. "So what I'd like you to do is take my mother's hat off your head, put it on that table, and walk out to whatever car brought you here." Meredith stared at her for a moment, then set down the iced tea on the side table with a small, controlled click. She didn't move toward the door. She said, "You think you're the only person who planned for things?" "I think," Harper said, "that you should leave before I call the sheriff." Meredith lifted her chin, turned, and walked through the kitchen toward the back porch. The screen door banged behind her. The hat stayed on her head. Harper stood in the living room and breathed. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard. The moving truck was still there. One of the movers was sitting on the tailgate, scrolling his phone. After a moment, Tanner appeared from the direction of the dock, with Presley beside him, and they were talking in the low, urgent way of two people who'd just realized something hadn't gone the way they expected. Harper watched them. She noticed the way Tanner put his hand on Presley's elbow when he was making a point. The same gesture he used to use with her in social situations. The light touch that looked like affection and was actually direction. She noticed Presley was wearing boots despite the heat, the kind of boots that said she'd wanted to look a certain way when she arrived here. She noticed Tanner's jaw working the way it did when he was recalculating. He looked up at the window and saw her standing there. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Harper turned away from the window and walked down the hall toward her parents' bedroom. Her mother's things were still there, mostly. The quilt on the bed, the photograph on the nightstand of her parents at the lake, younger than Harper was now, squinting into the sun and laughing at whoever was behind the camera. Someone had opened the closet and pushed things aside, but nothing had been removed yet. Harper put her hand on the closet door and closed it. She sat down on the edge of the bed. For the first time since Ruth Ann Pickett's phone call that morning, she let herself feel the full weight of what she was looking at. Not just the betrayal of this specific day, the moving truck, the hat, the dock, the flat declaration in front of witnesses, but the longer thing underneath it, the years of it. The way she had bent herself smaller and smaller in her own life, made herself manageable, convinced herself that what she wanted and what she was allowed to have were different categories of things. She had met Tanner Doyle when she was 29. She had loved him, genuinely, in the beginning. She had also, she understood now, been somewhat in love with the idea of being someone who was loved by a man like Tanner. Someone with ambition and confidence, and a way of entering rooms like he owned them. She'd been younger than she was now, and she hadn't yet learned to question whether the person entering rooms like that was actually someone you could trust inside a room. She picked up the photograph from the nightstand. Her parents, laughing. She tried to remember who had been behind the camera. She couldn't. Her father had never trusted Tanner. He'd been careful about it, thoughtful, never said anything outright cruel. But Gerald Doyle was a man who watched people closely and took his time forming opinions, and once formed them, held them. He had watched Tanner for 3 years before he sat down with his attorney and had the trust documents rewritten. He'd never told Harper the specifics of what he was worried about. He'd just said, "This is your legacy, sweetheart. Make sure it stays yours." She'd thought he was being overprotective. She'd even been mildly irritated. She hadn't understood what he was telling her. She was sitting on the edge of her parents' bed, holding their photograph, listening to the sounds of Tanner's voice somewhere outside the window. Managing the movers, she thought, or managing Presley, or managing some version of the situation. And she felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, not exactly. More like the particular stillness that comes when you finally stop pretending a thing is something other than what it is. She set the photograph down. She reached into her bag for her phone and scrolled to the contact for Patrick Holloway, her father's attorney, the man who had drafted the trust documents. It was barely past 3 in the afternoon. He picked up on the second ring. "Patrick, it's Harper Doyle. I need to talk to you about the trust documents, specifically the enforcement provisions." She paused. "Someone is attempting to occupy the Calder Lake property. I'm going to need to know exactly what I can do about it." Patrick Holloway was 73 years old and had practiced property law in Calder's Bend for 45 years. He'd been friends with her father. He said, "Tell me what's happening, Harper." She told him. When she finished, there was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Patrick said, "Your father was a smart man." "I know," Harper said. "You have every legal right to have them removed. The trust is unambiguous." Another pause. "Does Tanner know about the specific provisions?" "I don't think he read the documents carefully. He may have assumed that our marriage gave him some claim." "It does not." Patrick's voice was dry. "Not to a trust structured the way Gerald set it up. Do you want me to make some calls?" "Not tonight. I just needed to know where I stand." "You stand on solid ground," he said. "That's what your father built." She thanked him and hung up. Outside the window, the moving truck engine turned over. She heard it pull forward in the gravel, the particular sound of a heavy vehicle finding its way out of a tight turnaround. She got up and went to look. The truck was backing out to the road. One of the movers jogged alongside to direct it. Tanner stood near his car, the gray Lexus she'd seen 100 times, with his arms crossed, watching the truck. Presley was inside the car. Meredith was nowhere visible. He stood there after the truck had gone, for longer than made sense, just standing in the gravel turnaround, looking at the house. Harper watched him from the window, far enough back that she didn't think he could see her clearly. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had arrived expecting something and found something else. She wasn't sure what he'd expected. Maybe that she wouldn't come. Maybe that she'd arrive and cry or argue or make a scene that he could characterize later as unreasonable. Maybe he'd simply assumed she wouldn't know what to do. After a while, he got in the car. Harper watched the Lexus reverse out to the road and disappear around the bend through the pines. She stood in the quiet for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen, found the old faucet still dripping in that familiar irregular rhythm, and stood there listening to it. She didn't try to stop it. She got herself a glass of water, sat down at the table where her parents had eaten breakfast 10,000 times, and looked out the window at the lake going gold in the late afternoon light. Her father used to say that the best view of the water was from the kitchen table because it was where you actually sat. She'd never disagreed. She was tired, and there was a great deal still in front of her. Phone calls, documents, decisions she'd been putting off and couldn't anymore. She knew that. But right now the truck was gone, and the house was quiet, and the lake was doing what the lake always did, which was catch the light and hold it for a while before letting it go. She sat at the table and let herself just be in the house. After a while, she got up and unplugged the air freshener she found in the outlet near the stove. Opened the kitchen window, let the real air in. It smelled like pine and water, and something underneath that was just the house itself, the specific and irreplaceable smell of a place that had held her family's life for decades. She breathed it in until it felt like hers again. Then she started making a list of what she needed to do next. She slept that night in her parents' bed, which she hadn't done since her mother was alive. It wasn't a plan. She'd simply walked back down the hall after making her list, after eating a sleeve of crackers she'd found in the pantry that were only slightly stale, after standing at the back porch screen long enough to watch the last of the light leave the lake. And when she reached the doorway of the bedroom, she just went in and lay down on top of the quilt and closed her eyes. She didn't change clothes. She was still in the flannel shirt she'd put on that morning in a different life, in a rental apartment in Asheville where she'd been thinking about olive oil and dentist appointments. She slept hard, which surprised her. She'd expected to lie awake with her mind running, and instead she went under quickly and didn't surface until the birds outside the window started before dawn. She lay there in the gray light and listened to the lake. The water had a sound in the early morning, a small lapping rhythm against the dock pilings, that she had grown up with and then gone years without hearing. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed it until it was back. That was the thing about sounds from your childhood. They sat somewhere below conscious memory and waited. By 6:30, she was up. She found coffee in the freezer. Her mother had always kept a backup, and got a pot going. The kitchen was cold enough that she could see her breath for the first half hour, which told her the propane levels were low and she'd need to deal with that. She added it to the list. The list had 12 items on it by now. She kept writing as she drank her coffee, standing at the kitchen counter, because she hadn't yet decided to make herself comfortable. There was something in her that was still treating this as temporary, still half waiting to be told she'd misunderstood the situation. She recognized the instinct and mistrusted it. It was the same instinct that had kept her in her marriage for 2 years longer than she should have been. Around 7, her phone rang. She expected it to be Tanner. It was her cousin Lena calling from Savannah. "Ruth Ann Pickett called me," Lena said without preamble. "She didn't have your number, but she had mine from the funeral. Are you at the lake?" "I am." "And?" "He's gone for now, him and Presley and his mother." Harper paused. "He had a moving truck, Lena. He was actually moving them in." There was a short silence on the other end of the line. Lena was Harper's only cousin on her father's side, older by 4 years, sharper by about 20 in practical terms. And she had never liked Tanner with a consistency that Harper had once found exhausting and now found fortifying. "That son of a bitch," Lena said. "I need to get the divorce process started. I've been putting it off and I can't anymore." "You've been putting it off because you thought there was something to save." "I know." "Harper." Lena's voice went careful in the way it did when she was about to say something true. "Was there? At any point in the last year, was there actually anything left?" Harper looked out the kitchen window at the dock. The morning light was coming sideways across the water, making everything golden and flat and still. "I think I was protecting something that was already gone," she said. "I think I'd been doing that for a long time." "Okay." Lena let that settle. "What do you need?" "I need a lawyer, a real one. Not Patrick, I love Patrick, but I need a divorce attorney who's going to take Tanner seriously and not be charmed by him." "I know someone," Lena said immediately. "She's in Asheville. Maura Finch. She's handled some very ugly splits and she doesn't mess around. I'll text you her number." "Thank you." "Are you sleeping? Eating?" "I slept. I found crackers." "That's not eating." "It's the beginning of eating." Lena made a sound that was half exasperation, half something softer. "I can drive up this weekend if you need me. Let me get a few days under my feet first. I'll call you." After she hung up, she stood in the kitchen and drank the rest of her coffee and thought about what Lena had asked her, whether there had been anything left to save. The honest answer was more complicated than what she'd said on the phone, because the truth was she'd known the marriage was over for longer than she'd admitted even to herself. Had known it in the way you know things you're not ready to act on, in the background, constant, like the drip of the kitchen faucet. The real question, the one she was only now starting to be able to look at directly, was why she'd stayed in that knowing without moving. What she'd been afraid of. She thought she was probably afraid of exactly this, the size of the empty space once the thing was gone. Patrick Holloway arrived at 10 that morning, earlier than she'd expected, driving the same brown sedan she remembered from her father's funeral. He was a tall man, thin in the angular way of men who'd been lean their whole lives. With white hair he kept short and reading glasses he was forever misplacing. He'd been her father's attorney, and, in the years since, something like a family steward. Not family exactly, but the kind of trusted professional who knows where all the documents are and whom you call when things go wrong. He had a folder under his arm when he came up the porch steps. Harper held the screen door and he came in, and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd been sitting the night before, and he opened the folder. "Your father was thorough," Patrick said. He took out a document and turned it so she could read the header. Doyle Family Preservation Trust, amended and restated, dated 14 months before Gerald Doyle's death. He came to, let me think, about 3 years before he passed. He wanted to restructure everything. He was very specific about what he wanted. "He didn't tell me about all of it," Harper said. "No, he told me you had enough on your mind." Patrick said it matter-of-factly, without the careful tone people sometimes used when they were implying something about her marriage. But the implication was there, quiet and plain. Her father had known something wasn't right. He'd just decided to protect her instead of trouble her. The trust holds the lake property and the surrounding acreage, Patrick continued. 47 acres total, including about 1,100 feet of lake frontage. You are the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary during your lifetime. There is no provision by which a spouse, current or former, can claim any interest in trust assets. That's explicit language. Your father asked for it specifically. Tanner must have assumed that marriage gave him some claim. People often do assume that. It doesn't. Patrick took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. What concerns me more is the reason he may have wanted to establish a presence here. Harper looked at him. What do you mean? I've heard some things. Local talk, which you know I don't usually put much stock in, but there's been activity in this county for the past 18 months. Land surveys, inquiries from outside developers, some zoning discussions at the county level that haven't made the papers yet, but that people here know about. He paused. Someone has been quietly putting together a development proposal for the eastern shore of Calder Lake, the kind of proposal that would need significant lake frontage to be viable. Harper set down her coffee cup. How significant? Well, that's the thing. Patrick opened the folder to a second document, a hand-drawn map with annotations she didn't immediately recognize. Your family's 47 acres sits at the center of approximately 320 acres of land along this stretch of the shoreline. Most of that surrounding acreage is either undeveloped private land or conservation easement territory. But the Doyle property is the anchor. Without access to it, the geometry of any large-scale development along here doesn't work. The parcels on either side become essentially landlocked from the lake. Harper studied the map. And Tanner knows this. I think, Patrick said carefully, that Tanner has known it for some time. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a boat passed somewhere on the lake. She could hear the engine, faint and distant. She sat with what Patrick had just told her and felt the shape of it rearrange something in her understanding, the way you feel a picture shift when you see the hidden image inside it. The affair, the separation, the moving truck, the declaration on the dock, all of it had felt like Tanner simply being Tanner, ambitious and careless and finally done pretending. But this was something different. This was Tanner calculating, planning, and it had been in motion before any of it surfaced. He wasn't just taking the house, she said. I don't believe so, no. He was trying to establish occupancy, a claim. It wouldn't have held up in court, given the trust structure, but it would have complicated things, created delay. Patrick folded his hands on the table. Delay is sometimes the point, long enough to get things moving at the county level before the ownership questions got resolved. Harper sat back in her chair. She thought about Tanner standing on the dock the day before, the linen shirt, the reading glasses pushed up, Presley's hand on his arm. She thought about how little he'd seemed concerned when she arrived, how quickly he'd gone to the flat declaration, the dismissal. Not because he was confident it would work, she understood now, because he'd needed to establish something, to create a fact on the ground. I want to know everything about this development proposal, she said. Whatever is in the public record, whatever isn't. I want to understand what he was planning to do with this property. I can make some inquiries, Patrick said. I have a friend at the county planning office. I'd also like to look at the conservation easements on the surrounding land. The 1,100 feet of frontage, if I understand what you're telling me correctly, that frontage is what makes this viable or not viable for a large development. Patrick looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that wasn't quite surprise, more like recognition. Your father asked me the same kind of questions, he said, about the conservation law. He was protecting the property. He was. And there may be more you can do in that vein. Patrick gathered his documents. Let me do some homework and come back to you. In the meantime, I'd strongly advise changing the locks. Already on the list. He smiled at that briefly. Good girl, he said, which was the kind of thing a man of his generation said, and which Harper had stopped finding patronizing and started finding almost sweet, coming from him. She walked him to his car. The morning had warmed up, the pine trees giving off that dry, resinous smell they had when the sun hit them, and the lake was visible through the tree line, still and blue. Patrick shook her hand at the car door. He was a handshaker, always had been. And then he stopped and said, Harper, I want you to know something. Your father was a private man. He didn't say a lot, but he talked about you often. He was proud of you. Not of what you accomplished or who you married, just of you. He paused. I think he'd want you to know that. Harper looked at him. She felt something move in her throat that she wasn't going to let become crying. Not right now, not standing in the gravel drive in yesterday's flannel shirt. "Thank you, Patrick," she said. He nodded and got in the car. She stood in the drive and watched him go, and then she turned and looked at the house. Really looked at it, the way you sometimes can't when you're inside a thing. The white clapboard siding needed paint in a few places. The porch screen had a tear she hadn't noticed. The fern baskets by the door were dead and needed to come down. There was a gutter on the north side that had pulled loose from the fascia board. All of it fixable. All of it exactly the kind of thing that accumulated when a house went unloved for a season, and that a house could come back from. She went inside and added painting to the list. Maura Finch's office was in a narrow brick building on the west side of Asheville, wedged between a dry cleaner and an insurance agency. Harper drove back Thursday afternoon for the appointment Lena's text had set up. The office had good light and legal books stacked on every surface, and a plant on the windowsill that had seen better days. Maura Finch herself was 50-something, sturdy, with short dark hair going silver at the temples, and a way of listening that suggested she was categorizing information as it arrived. Harper told her everything. Not just the dock and the moving truck, but the 4 months of separation and the 2 years before that, the way the marriage had thinned and then disappeared. She told her about the lake house and the trust, and what Patrick had said about the development proposal. She didn't editorialize. She just went through it in order. When she finished, Maura Finch said, "How long have you known about the woman?" "Presley? I suspected for about a year. I confirmed it, in the sense of seeing them together yesterday." "Have you seen messages, emails, anything documented?" "No, I didn't look." Maura nodded, writing something. "That's actually fine. North Carolina is a no-fault state, so the affair simplifies some things but doesn't change the fundamentals." She looked up. "The property is the bigger issue. Tell me again about the trust structure." Harper walked her through it again, and Maura wrote while she talked. "The thing you need to understand," Maura said when Harper finished, "is that Tanner may have known for some time that the trust made this property inaccessible to him through normal marital channels, which would explain why he tried to establish occupancy by other means. Physical presence, personal property on site, his mother living there. These are attempts to create an ambiguity that didn't actually exist legally. But ambiguity creates litigation, and litigation creates cost and delay. Patrick said the same thing. That delay might have been the point. Probably was. If there's a development deal in the works, the timing matters. He needed the property questions to look unresolved long enough to get past certain decision points. Maura set her pen down. "The good news is that your father's trust documents are apparently very clear. The bad news is that Tanner knows lawyers, and if he decides to contest things, we're in for a process." "I'm not afraid of a process," Harper said. "I just want it done correctly." "Good." Maura looked at her steadily. "I want you to be honest with me about something. Is there any part of you that wants to reconcile? Because that changes my approach." Harper didn't hesitate. "No." "You're sure?" "He stood on my parents' dock and told me I wasn't his wife anymore, in front of his girlfriend and his mother and 2 men from a moving company." She paused. "I was already sure before that. That just made it easy to say out loud." Maura picked her pen back up. "All right, then let's talk about what we're filing and when." The drive back to Calder's Bend took the usual 2 hours 40 minutes. Harper drove with the radio off, which was unusual for her. She normally needed noise when she drove, something to keep the thinking from getting too loud. But tonight she didn't want distraction. She wanted to sit inside the reality of what she'd just set in motion. She'd signed the retainer agreement in Maura Finch's office. That was the thing about signing documents. It converted intention into fact. She had been intending to end her marriage for months in the abstract, private, unshared way of someone who knows what needs to happen but hasn't yet made it real. Now it was real. There were papers with her signature on them. There would be more papers. There would be Tanner receiving those papers, and whatever came after that. She tried to locate fear somewhere in herself and found mostly just exhaustion. And underneath the exhaustion, something quieter. Not relief, not yet. More like the particular stillness of a decision that's finally the same on the inside as it looks on the outside. She stopped for gas outside of Black Mountain and stood at the pump in the cooling evening air. A family was piling out of the minivan at the next pump. A man and a woman and 2 kids, the younger one crying about something, the older one already inside the gas station store. Ordinary enough that she noticed it and then looked away. She didn't feel sad about it exactly. She felt something adjacent to sad, which was harder to name. She got back in the car and drove. The locksmith had come that afternoon while she was in Asheville. She'd arranged it before she left, found his number on a local bulletin board website her mother had bookmarked on the house computer, which told her something about how old the bookmark was. He'd left a note on the kitchen table with the new keys and a handwritten invoice that felt touchingly old-fashioned. Harper had paid it over the phone and now had 2 new keys on a ring with a small metal fish charm that the locksmith had apparently included as a gift, which was the kind of thing that happened in small towns and which she hadn't expected to find comforting but did. She let herself in with the new key and stood in the dark hallway for a moment before finding the light switch. The house felt different at night, more itself, she thought. Fewer distractions, no light competing with the windows. She turned on the lamp in the living room, the one she'd put back on her mother's reading table, and the room came up warm and imperfect and familiar. She put her bag down and went to the kitchen. She'd bought groceries in Asheville on her way out of town. Actual groceries, not just crackers. She made herself a real dinner, which felt like a more deliberate act than it should have been. Pasta with olive oil and garlic, nothing sophisticated. Something her mother had made on nights when she didn't feel like cooking, but still wanted to eat something that felt like care. Harper ate it standing at the kitchen counter because she hadn't decided where she wanted to sit yet in this house. Which rooms were hers again, and which still felt like her parents'. She'd figure that out over time. She was cleaning up when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Tanner. She let it ring. Then it rang again. Then a text came through. We need to talk. Not about what you think. She set the phone face down on the counter and finished washing the pot. He texted twice more before she turned the lights off. She didn't read the second one. She knew what we need to talk meant when Tanner said it. It meant he'd assessed the situation and recalculated and was now going to try a different approach. The first approach had been the moving truck and the flat declaration. The second approach would be reasonable Tanner, reasonable conversation Tanner, the man who could make almost anything sound like a misunderstanding that 2 adults of good faith could work through if they'd just sit down together. She had sat down with reasonable Tanner many times. She knew how those conversations ended. She always came away feeling like she'd been agreed with and dismissed simultaneously. She went to bed and read until she fell asleep, which was something she hadn't done in months. There had always been some reason not to in the apartment. The light bothered her, or she was too tired to start, or she'd lie there reading the same paragraph 4 times and give up. Here she read 40 pages of a novel she'd found on her mother's bookshelf. A mystery set in coastal Maine, with a main character who was stubborn in a way Harper found restful to spend time with. She fell asleep with the light still on and the book open on her chest, and didn't wake up until morning. Thursday became Friday, and Friday became the weekend without the shape of days meaning much. She was working through the house systematically, not because she had a timeline, but because she needed something physical to do with her hands while the larger things arranged themselves in the background. She went room by room, slowly, not cleaning in the frantic way of someone trying to erase grief, but taking stock, opening closets, moving things that needed moving, sitting sometimes with a box of her parents' belongings and going through it carefully, deciding what to keep and what to let go and what to put aside until she was more ready. Her mother's hat turned up on the porch side table where Meredith had finally left it. Harper brought it inside and hung it on the hook by the door where her mother had always kept it. On Saturday morning, she drove into town for more supplies and ran into Ruth Ann Pickett at the hardware store. Ruth Ann was a solid, practical woman in her late 60s with short gray hair and a manner that suggested she'd gotten tired of being indirect somewhere around her 50th birthday. She'd lived on the road below the Doyle property for 20 years, had known Harper's parents well enough to bring food to the house after each of their deaths. "How are you holding up?" Ruth Ann asked, standing in the paint aisle with a color chip in each hand. "Better than I expected," Harper said. "Thank you for calling me. It mattered." Ruth Ann waved it off. "I wasn't going to stand there and watch some man move into your mother's house." She looked at Harper directly. "I hope you know what you're dealing with, that husband of yours. He's been sniffing around this county for a while, not just the last few days." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've seen his car on this road more than once in the past year, driving slow, stopping at the property line, sitting there for a while, then leaving." She paused. "I thought it was strange, but I figured it was your business. Now I'm not so sure I should have stayed out of it. Harper felt the familiar settling shift in her chest that she'd felt when Patrick showed her the map. When did you first notice that? Ruth Ann thought about it. Spring? Last spring. Maybe 14, 15 months ago. Which was, Harper calculated, several months before Tanner had moved out of their house in Asheville. He had been watching the property before the marriage formally ended. He had been planning before he'd shown any sign to her that anything was ending. Ruth Ann, she said, did you ever see him with anyone when he came? Once, a woman, young, blonde. They got out and walked the property line near the north fence. Had a map or something, a tablet maybe. Presley, almost certainly. The woman who was his assistant and his lover, and it was becoming clear, his collaborator. Can I ask you something? Ruth Ann said. What are you going to do with the place, if you don't mind my asking? I'm going to keep it, Harper said. I'm going to fix what needs fixing and keep it. Ruth Ann nodded, something in her expression settling with approval. Your parents would want that. I know. She drove back to the house with the hardware supplies and spent the afternoon painting the trim on the south side porch, which was the most accessible section and the most visibly peeling. It was meticulous, unhurried work, and she wasn't particularly good at it. She dripped twice and had to correct the line along the window frame 3 times before she got it right. But the result of each hour was visible and concrete, and that was what she needed right now. Problems with visible and concrete results. She was cleaning brushes at the outdoor spigot when her phone rang again. Not Tanner this time. A number she didn't recognize, but a Calder's Bend area code. Harper Doyle? A man's voice, brisk and unfamiliar. Yes? My name is Dale Pritchard. I'm with Cascadia Development Group out of Charlotte. I was given your number by, well, I was hoping we might be able to set up a time to speak. We're involved in a project in your area, and I understand you hold some property interest in the region. Harper straightened up slowly. She turned off the spigot. Where did you get my number, Mr. Pritchard? A brief hesitation. I believe a mutual contact passed it along. A mutual contact? Would that contact happen to be Tanner Doyle? Another pause, longer this time. I'm not sure I'm in a position to say. I see. She kept her voice even. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Pritchard. I'm not in a position to discuss any property interests with anyone right now. If your company wants to make any formal inquiry regarding land in this area, it should go through my attorney. She gave him Patrick Holloway's name and number from memory. Is there anything else? Mrs. Doyle, I don't think you understand the scope of what we're... I understood you just fine, she said. Have a good evening. She hung up and stood there by the spigot with the damp paintbrush still in her hand and looked at the lake through the trees. Cascadia Development Group. She went inside and typed the name into her phone. They had a website, professional, sleek, the kind of design that communicated a certain level of capital investment. Projects across the Carolinas and Georgia. Luxury residential and mixed-use development. Waterfront specialization. She scrolled through their portfolio. The projects were large. She was looking at the planned footage of a lake development in upstate South Carolina. Similar geography to Calder Lake, similar scale when she found what she was looking for. The project description mentioned it had required assembly of multiple private land parcels to create sufficient waterfront access for the planned resort community. Resort community. She thought about the 1,100 feet of Doyle family frontage. She thought about Tanner standing on the dock in his linen shirt. She thought about 14 months ago, a woman with a tablet walking the property line in the spring. She called Patrick. He picked up on the third ring, and she could hear the evening news in the background. Patrick, have you heard of Cascadia Development Group out of Charlotte? A pause. I've heard the name. Why? They just called me. Someone gave them my number. I see. The television sound went quiet. He'd muted it. That's faster than I expected them to move. You knew they were involved? I heard they were circling the county. I didn't know they'd made contact with you directly. Another pause. This is Tanner's deal, Harper. Or at least he's attached to it. From what I've gathered, he brought the project to them. Or they found the project, and he made himself the man who could deliver the key parcel. The key parcel being this property. Yes. She sat down on the arm of her mother's reading chair, which was not a comfortable place to sit, but was the closest thing to her. What kind of project are we talking about, specifically? Luxury lakeside resort and residential development. 140 units, marina, event center. The projection I heard mentioned was approximately 90 million in projected revenue over build-out. He let that number sit in the air between them for a moment. To be clear, this is all based on conversation and county-level talk, not documents I've seen. But the outline is consistent. $90 million. Harper looked at the lamp her mother had loved, the light it threw on the old wood floor, the stack of novels by the reading chair. If they built that, she said slowly, what happens to the lake? The shoreline in that stretch would be unrecognizable inside of 5 years. The conservation land on either side would be under pressure. There'd be legal challenges to those easements, and frankly, some of them might not hold up if a well-funded developer decided to contest them. Patrick's voice was careful and even, the voice of a man who had practiced not letting his opinions get ahead of his facts, but the facts here said enough. The community would change. The character of this area would change. Harper thought about Ruth Ann Pickett in the hardware store, about the town she'd grown up driving into with her father on Saturday mornings, picking up supplies, knowing people by name at the counter, about the particular quality of summer light on this stretch of lake that had existed, unchanged, her entire life. He would have done all of that, she said. He would have sold all of that for a real estate deal. Patrick didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said, I think Tanner sees land as a function, what it can produce, what it can be converted into. A pause. Your father saw it differently. My father understood what it was for. Yes, Patrick said simply. He did. After she hung up, she sat for a while in the reading chair, properly this time, letting herself sink into it. The evening was coming down outside. The lake went the color it turned at dusk, a deep blue-gray with a line of silver where the last light caught the water. She thought about her father drafting those trust documents, sitting across from Patrick in that same office where she'd sat this week, going through the language, making it specific and airtight, protecting the property not just from accident or complication, but from exactly the kind of thing that had just tried to happen. He couldn't have known the details. He'd just known enough to know he needed to make it safe. She wondered if he'd understood how lonely she'd been in her marriage. She thought probably yes, in the way he understood most things, quietly, without announcing it, just responding to what he saw. The kitchen faucet dripped in the other room. She listened to it for a while without getting up to do anything about it. By the end of the following week, the picture had filled in considerably. Patrick had made his inquiries and come back with more specifics. Maura Finch had made contact with Tanner's attorney, a Charlotte-based firm Harper recognized by name from the Asheville business community. Expensive and aggressive, which told her something about how seriously Tanner was taking this, or at least how much he wanted to look like he was. Lena had driven up from Savannah on Thursday and spent 2 nights sleeping in Harper's parents' second bedroom, drinking wine on the porch in the evenings, and not asking Harper how she felt because Lena understood that asking people how they felt usually made them feel worse. On Friday evening, they were sitting on the dock, which Harper had not allowed herself to use since she'd arrived, treating it somehow as contested ground. But Lena had walked down to it without ceremony and sat at the end with her feet near the water and looked back at Harper and said, "Are you going to stand there or are you going to sit down?" And Harper had sat down. The water was calm. A heron was working the far bank in that unhurried, precise way herons had. They sat for a while without talking, which was one of the things Harper valued most about Lena. She didn't need to feel quiet. Eventually Lena said, "What are you going to do? Long term? Are you staying here?" "I don't know yet," Harper said. "The apartment in Asheville is month to month. I haven't made any decisions about work or where I'm going to live once everything settles." "You could stay here," Lena said. "You could make this your actual home." "I've been thinking about that." "I know." Lena was quiet for a moment. "I also know it's hard to think about moving into your parents' house without it feeling like something sad instead of something right." "It feels like both," Harper said, "at the same time. That's usually how the real things feel." Harper looked at the water. The heron had moved farther down the bank, slow and deliberate. "He called me again," she said. "Tanner." I finally answered. Lena looked at her but didn't say anything. "He wanted to meet in person. He said there were things I didn't understand about the situation. He was very calm about it, very, you know how he gets, very measured, like he was being patient with me." "What did you say?" "I told him to contact my attorney." Harper paused. He got less measured after that. He said I was making this adversarial when it didn't need to be. He said the property was just sitting there unused and he was trying to do something practical with it, and I was being sentimental. Sentimental, Lena repeated. That's the word he used. Lena was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I said that my father spent 40 years building something worth being sentimental about, and that I intended to take care of it. Harper looked at her hands in her lap. And then I hung up. The heron lifted from the far bank in a slow, unhurried arc and disappeared over the tree line. He's not going to make this easy, Lena said. I know. He's going to push. I know that too. Lena reached over and put her hand briefly on Harper's knee. Not a long gesture, not an emotional one, just a contact that said, I'm here, which was what Harper needed and Lena always knew. Then she pulled her hand back and looked out at the water. Then let him push, she said. Let's see what this property looks like when you push back. Lena left Sunday morning, backing her car out of the gravel drive with one hand on the wheel and one arm out the window in a wave that didn't look back. Harper stood on the porch and watched her go and felt the particular quiet that follows someone's presence. Not loneliness exactly, but the echo of company. She went inside and washed both their coffee cups and put them away. And then she stood at the kitchen window for a few minutes doing nothing, which was something she was getting better at. The second week at the lake had a different texture than the first. The first week had been emergency and adrenaline, the acute logistics of a situation that had to be dealt with immediately. The second week was something slower and in some ways harder, the work of settling in, of making decisions without the urgency that had initially carried her, of waking up each morning in her parents' house and figuring out what she was actually doing here. She'd spoken with Maura Finch twice that week. The divorce filing had been submitted. Tanner's attorneys had responded quickly, which Maura said was typical. Expensive firms billed hourly and had every incentive to generate correspondence. The initial response was predictably strategic, a letter raising questions about marital assets, about the timeline of the separation, about various financial matters that Maura read aloud to Harper over the phone, with the particular flat intonation of someone cataloging nonsense they've seen before. They're going to try to argue that the lake house functioned as a marital asset regardless of the trust structure, Maura said. They'll claim you both used it, that marital funds may have been used for maintenance, that there's a reasonable claim to some interest. Marital funds were never used for this property, Harper said. My father's estate handled all the maintenance costs through the trust account. Do you have documentation of that? Patrick will. Good. Get it to me. A pause. I want to be straightforward with you, Harper. Tanner's attorneys are going to make this uncomfortable for a while. That's their job. They're going to file motions and generate paperwork and try to make the process feel overwhelming. The goal is to get you to either settle for less than you should or to make a mistake out of frustration. Don't do either. I won't, Harper said. I know. Maura's voice had a brisk confidence in it that Harper was starting to find genuinely reassuring. We have the stronger position. We just have to be patient with the process. Patient with the process. Harper wrote that on a piece of paper and put it on the kitchen counter next to her list, which now had 23 items on it, 11 of which were crossed off. It was Patrick who called on the Tuesday of the third week, earlier than his usual hours, which told her before he said anything that something had moved. I've heard from my contact at the county planning office, he said. There's a public hearing scheduled. Zoning variance request for approximately 310 acres of mixed lakeshore and upland property on the eastern shore of Calder Lake. Cascadia Development is the applicant. He paused. The hearing is in 18 days. Harper sat down. That's fast. They've apparently been in process for some time. The application was filed 8 months ago. This hearing was always coming. We just didn't know the timeline until now. 8 months ago. She ran the arithmetic automatically. 8 months ago, she and Tanner had still been living in the same house in Asheville, or nearly. He'd left in month 6 of that 8, which meant this had been in motion while they were still, technically, married and cohabitating. While she was still trying to have the kind of conversations that might save something. While he was scheduling planning department meetings and walking property lines with Presley in a tablet. Is the Doyle property included in the application, she asked. It's adjacent to the primary parcel. Listed in the application as a connecting acquisition, their language is anticipated supplemental access parcel. They're treating it as a contingent part of the plan, essentially representing to the county that they expect to have access to it. Harper felt something specific and sharp in her chest. They told the county they expected to have this land. In language that implies acquisition is underway or likely, yes. Patrick, that's... She stopped, chose her words carefully. They filed an application representing access to a property they have no legal claim to, belonging to a woman who was never consulted. That's one way to read it. His voice was careful in the particular way that meant he agreed with her and was deciding how directly to say so. It would be another way to read it to say they filed in anticipation of a transaction they expected to complete through other means, and those means have not yet been formally foreclosed. But they are foreclosed. The trust forecloses them. Yes, but the county planning department doesn't know that, and as long as Tanner hasn't corrected the record with them, he hasn't told them the acquisition isn't happening. Not that I'm aware of. Harper stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The lake was flat and gray under overcast sky, the kind of day that made the water look like hammered metal. She looked at it and thought about the resort community in the Cascadia Portfolio website. 140 units, a marina, an event center. The shoreline in that stretch would be unrecognizable inside of 5 years, Patrick had said. I want to attend that hearing, she said. I thought you might. A pause. I'll be there with you. I want to understand the application. Everything that's been filed. Is that public record? Most of it, yes. I can pull what's available and go through it with you this week. Good. She looked at the lake. And Patrick, the conservation land surrounding the Doyle property. The easements you mentioned. I want to understand those in detail. What they cover, who holds them, what it would mean for the development if they were strengthened rather than challenged. A longer pause this time. What are you thinking? I'm thinking my father protected 47 acres and 1,100 feet of frontage because he understood what it was worth. And I'm thinking that the land around this property has value that goes beyond what any developer is going to put in a planning application. She paused. I'm thinking there may be more to protect here than just this house. Patrick was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice. Not surprise, but the tone of a man recalibrating. I'll make some calls to the land trust organizations I know in this region. There's a conservation group out of Asheville that holds several easements along this lake already. They might be very interested in talking to you. That's where I'd start, Harper said. She drove into town that afternoon and went to the county planning office, which was in a low brick building across from the courthouse that smelled like paper and carpet cleaner and had a waiting area with chairs in a color she could only describe as institutional beige. A young man at the front desk found the Cascadia application and printed her a copy of the public filing packet, 43 pages, more than she'd expected, dense with survey maps and environmental impact statements and projected traffic studies, and the kind of language that made straightforward things sound impossibly technical. She sat in the parking lot and read it cover to cover. It took 2 hours. She made notes in the margins of 3 pages and circled 2 specific sections. The first was the description of the supplemental access parcel, which was the Doyle property, described in language that strongly implied ownership transfer was in progress. The language didn't say completed, but it didn't say anticipated or proposed either. It occupied a deliberate middle space, the kind of language chosen specifically to avoid triggering disclosure requirements while still letting the inference land. The second section she circled was the environmental impact assessment for the lakeshore itself, specifically the section on existing conservation easements. The assessment acknowledged 3 existing easements on adjacent parcels and noted them as potential constraints, but then argued, in 3 careful paragraphs, that the development plan's design had been structured to avoid those easements and that no variance from existing conservation protections would be required. Harper read those 3 paragraphs twice. Then she took out her phone and called Patrick. The environmental impact section, she said. It claims no conservation variance is required because the development avoids the existing easements. But if there were additional easements that didn't exist yet when this application was filed, then the application's environmental analysis would be incomplete, Patrick said, and the planning board would be evaluating a plan based on an inaccurate picture of the conservation landscape. Could new easements be put in place before the hearing? 18 days is tight, but it's not impossible depending on the land trust and the property owners involved. He paused. You're thinking about the parcels adjacent to yours. I'm thinking about whether the owners of those parcels know what's about to happen to their lake. There were 4 private parcels that bordered or neighbored the Doyle property along the shoreline, 3 to the north, 1 to the south. Harper had their property records pulled from the county assessor's office the same afternoon. 2 of the parcels were owned by families who'd had them for decades. One was owned by a woman named Carol Sweeney, who'd inherited it from her parents. One was owned by a retired couple named Granger, who'd bought it 15 years ago. She didn't know any of them personally, but Ruth Ann Pickett did. Carol Sweeney is about 70, Ruth Ann told her that evening, sitting at Harper's kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She's never shown any interest in selling. She and her sister used to come up every summer, but the sister passed a few years back, and Carol still comes, but she's alone. She might not know anything about what Cascadia is planning. A pause. The Grangers are good people, retired school teachers from Charlotte. They use the property summers and some of fall. They've put a lot of work into their place. Do you know how to reach them? I have Carol's number somewhere, the Grangers I see around. I can get you their contact. I'd like to talk to them. Before the hearing, I want them to understand what the application means for this stretch of lake. Ruth Ann looked at her steadily. You're going to fight this. I'm going to go to that hearing and tell the planning board the truth about the ownership of this property and what it means for this application. Harper wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. And I'm going to make sure the people who live on this lake know what's being planned before the county makes any decisions. Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your father used to say that the people who care about a place are its best protection. Harper looked at her. He said that? At a town meeting, maybe 15 years ago. There was a smaller development proposal, came to nothing eventually. But your father spoke at that meeting. A pause. He was quiet about most things, but not about this lake. Harper thought about her father, who had been quiet about most things. She nodded and didn't say anything else. She called Carol Sweeney the next morning. Carol answered on the second ring with the careful hello of someone who'd learned to be cautious about unknown numbers. Harper introduced herself, explained who she was and who her parents had been, and said she had some information about a development proposal that Carol might want to hear. There was a silence on Carol's end. Then, the big resort thing? Harper paused. You know about it. Someone came to see me last spring, I think. A man and a woman, very polished, talking about a community vision and lakefront investment and all that. Carol's voice was dry. They made it sound like a lovely idea. I told them I wasn't interested in selling, and they left very nicely, and I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't, Harper said. They filed a planning application 8 months ago. There's a county hearing in 17 days. A longer silence this time. 17 days. Yes. And my property is part of this? Adjacent to it. The application describes this stretch of shoreline as central to the project. Your property would be under significant pressure if the development moves forward, even if you don't sell. The character of the area would change considerably. Carol was quiet for a moment. How do I find out more about this hearing? I can send you the public filing documents. And I'd like to meet with you in person if you're willing. I have some ideas about ways the neighboring property owners might be able to respond. I'll be up next week, Carol said. Come for coffee. The Grangers were easier. Ruth Ann had been right about them. Harper met them at their property the following Saturday, a neat cabin with a well-tended garden that was starting to go gold with the season. Tom Granger was a broad, deliberate man who listened without interrupting and asked sharp questions when Harper finished. His wife Janet stood with her arms crossed in the expression of someone who had spent 30 years in front of students and could identify a problem the moment it walked in the door. We've been watching that application work its way through, Tom said. We didn't know we could do anything about it. You can come to the hearing, Harper said, and if you're willing, I'd like to talk to you about a conservation easement on your property. It wouldn't limit your use of it, but it would make this stretch of lake significantly more difficult to develop. Tom and Janet exchanged a look that had 35 years of marriage in it. What would that involve? Janet asked. I've been in contact with a land trust organization in Asheville called the Blue Ridge Conservancy. They hold existing easements on 2 parcels further along this lake. They're very interested in discussing additional protections along this stretch. Harper paused. It's not a fast process normally, but given the hearing timeline, they've indicated they can expedite a preliminary agreement that would be on record before the county votes. How preliminary? Tom asked. Enough to put the planning board on notice that the environmental picture in the application is incomplete. She paused. Patrick Holloway is my attorney. He can walk you through the specifics. Tom Granger looked at his wife again. She unfolded her arms. Set up the meeting, she said. Tanner called on a Wednesday, 10 days before the hearing, while Harper was sitting on the porch going through the trust documents for the 4th time. She looked at the phone for 2 rings, then answered. I heard you've been talking to the neighbors, he said. No greeting. The measured tone was gone. In its place was something tighter, not quite angry, but close. I've been introducing myself, Harper said. A lot of people on this lake knew my parents. It's been good to reconnect. Harper. A pause. What you're doing with the conservancy, with the easements, you understand that's going to affect people beyond just this project. There are investors. There are commitments that have been made. Commitments involving property you don't own and were never going to own. Silence for a moment. You're being deliberately destructive. I'm protecting my family's property and making sure the people who live near it have accurate information about what's being planned for their lake. She kept her voice steady. You want to call that destructive? That's your business. You're going to hurt yourself with this, he said. His voice had gone to something she recognized. Not quite a threat, not quite a warning, the particular register that was both. You're not equipped for this level of, stop, she said. He stopped. Don't do that, she said. Don't tell me what I'm equipped for. You have been telling me for 11 years what I'm equipped for, and I have been listening, and I'm done listening. She paused. Contact my attorney, Tanner. She hung up. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that specifically. She set the phone down on the arm of the chair and looked at the lake and waited for her pulse to settle, which it did, fairly quickly. The conversation sat in her chest differently than she'd expected. She'd braced for the familiar aftermath of a confrontation with Tanner, the second guessing, the anxiety, the wondering if she'd said the wrong thing or said it wrong. Instead, she felt something that was almost clarity, the way a room looks when you finally turn the lights all the way up. She picked the trust documents back up and kept reading. Patrick arrived 2 days before the hearing with a folder considerably thicker than the one he'd brought the first time. He spread documents across the kitchen table and they went through them together for 2 hours while the coffee went cold. The Blue Ridge Conservancy had moved with uncommon speed. Preliminary easement agreements were in place for both the Granger parcel and Carol Sweeney's property, covering the lakeshore strips and the upland buffer areas that bordered each. The agreements weren't final, wouldn't be final for months, but they were documented, dated, and on record with the county registrar. It changes the math, Patrick said. The planning board has to evaluate the application against what's actually there, not what was there 8 months ago when Cascadia filed. And the misrepresentation about the Doyle property? Harper asked. I've drafted a letter to the planning board on your behalf, formally putting them on notice that the Doyle property is held in a protected family trust, that no acquisition is in progress, and that the application's characterization of the parcel as an anticipated supplemental access site is inaccurate. He slid the letter across the table. I'd like you to read it before I send it. She read it. It was precise and understated, the way Patrick wrote everything. She changed 2 words, made 2 phrases slightly more direct, and handed it back. He looked at the changes and nodded. Your father would have made the same edits, he said. He taught me to read documents, she said. On the morning of the hearing, Harper woke before the alarm she hadn't actually set. The lake was foggy, which it often was in the early fall mornings, the mist sitting low on the water and making the far bank invisible. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and thought, not about the hearing, but about a morning she was maybe 11 years old, standing in this same kitchen, watching the same morning fog while her father made breakfast behind her. He had never been a man who talked much before coffee. She had inherited that. They'd stood in the same comfortable quiet, looking at the foggy lake. And she'd asked him once why he liked fog, and he'd said because it made the familiar look like something you were seeing for the first time. She hadn't thought about that in years. She got dressed in what she thought of as her working clothes, dark slacks, a gray jacket, boots. Not a costume, not armor exactly, just clothes that said she was someone who had arrived with intention. She looked at herself in her mother's bathroom mirror for a moment. She looked tired, which was honest. She looked like herself, which was what she wanted. Patrick met her in the parking lot of the county building at 8:45. Tom and Janet Granger arrived 5 minutes later. Carol Sweeney came with her neighbor, a retired man named Frank, whose last name Harper never caught, but who had very strong feelings about the lake and made them known to Carol at some volume in the parking lot before they came inside. Ruth Ann Pickett was already in the building, sitting in the second row of the public gallery with her coat on her lap and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, which meant she'd already been reading the agenda. She scooted to make room when Harper came in. The hearing room was not large. It had the particular acoustic quality of rooms designed for municipal business. Hard floors, low ceilings, sound that went flat and official. A long table at the front for the planning board, 5 members. Harper didn't know except by name from the county website. A presentation area with a screen already set up. Maybe 40 people in the gallery, more than Harper had expected. And across the room, in the chairs on the far side of the aisle, Tanner, with 2 men Harper didn't recognize in suits that said Charlotte, not Calder's Bend, and Presley slightly behind him, with a leather portfolio on her lap. Tanner saw Harper come in. His expression didn't change. He was very good at that. She sat down next to Ruth Ann and put her folder on her lap and looked at the front of the room. The hearing opened at 9. The board chair, a woman named Denise Aldrich, who ran things with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this long enough to have seen every version of a contentious hearing, called the session to order and explained the agenda. Cascadia's presentation was first. One of the suited men who'd come with Tanner stood up and walked to the presentation area. His name was apparently Griffin Hale, and he was very good at his job in the way that people are good at jobs that involve making things sound better than they are. He had slides. He talked about community investment and sustainable lakefront development and economic benefit projections. He used the phrase generational opportunity twice. The slides were professional. The numbers were large and presented with the confidence of someone who'd had them prepared by people paid to make numbers look inevitable. Harper watched and listened and kept her expression neutral and wrote 3 things in the margin of her folder. When the presentation finished, the board chair opened the floor for public comment. Harper's hand went up before the chair had finished the sentence. She stood, walked to the front, and stated her name and her relationship to the Doyle property for the record. She spoke for 7 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She walked through the ownership of the property, the trust structure, the formal letter Patrick had submitted. She explained what the easement agreements with the Grangers and Carol Sweeney meant for the environmental analysis in the application. She named the specific section of the impact assessment and explained why it was now incomplete. She said the word inaccurate twice, specifically about the application's characterization of the Doyle parcel. She did not say Tanner's name once. When she sat down, the room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms get quiet when something has shifted without anyone quite deciding it had. Denise Aldrich looked at the folder in front of her. Then she looked at Griffin Hale, who was looking at Tanner. Tanner was looking at Harper. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second, then looked back at the board chair. She had more to say, and she was going to say it, and she was going to say it correctly and completely, and in a way that the public record would preserve clearly. Denise Aldrich gave Griffin Hale 5 minutes to respond to what Harper had put on the record. He used 4 of them, and what he said amounted to a very polished version of, "We weren't aware of recent developments, and we'd like the opportunity to review the new information before the board proceeds." He said it smoothly, with the practiced composure of a man who had been in rooms like this before and knew that composure was itself a kind of argument. But the content underneath the composure was essentially a request to slow down, and requests to slow down only came from people who needed time they hadn't expected to need. Denise Aldrich looked at her colleagues on the board. A brief, low exchange that Harper couldn't hear from the gallery. Then she turned back to the room. "We're going to table the vote pending review of the submitted documentation regarding property ownership and the updated conservation status of adjacent parcels," she said. "Applicant will have 30 days to respond to the public record as submitted. A follow-up hearing will be scheduled." She looked at the gallery. "Thank you all for being here." It wasn't a victory. Harper understood that clearly as the room began to move around her, people standing, gathering coats, the low noise of a public meeting dissolving. It was a pause. A 30-day pause in which Cascadia and Tanner and whoever else was attached to this deal would have time to regroup and recalibrate and come back with a response. She had not stopped anything. She had complicated it, which was different. But complicated was something. Complicated was what her father's trust documents had been designed to create, not a wall, because walls could eventually be climbed or broken, but a set of conditions that made proceeding without her consent so expensive and uncertain that the cost-benefit shifted. Patrick appeared at her elbow as she was putting her folder away. "That went well," he said, which from Patrick was roughly equivalent to anyone else saying that went extremely well. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes, but look at the room before they leave." She looked. Griffin Hale was on his phone, turned away from the gallery, his posture no longer reading as composed. The second suited man was leaning toward him, speaking low and fast. Tanner was standing near the door, and he was doing the thing he did when he was rerunning numbers in his head. Very still, jaw slightly tight, eyes not focused on anything specific in the room. She'd seen that look across dinner tables and in the car on the way home from things that hadn't gone the way he planned. She knew what it meant. It meant the plan he'd been holding in his head was no longer the shape it had been. Presley was beside him. She was looking at her phone and not at Tanner, which was also a small piece of information. Harper picked up her folder and walked toward the exit. She didn't look at Tanner as she passed. She was aware of him the way you're aware of something in your peripheral vision that you've decided not to turn toward. She went through the door and into the parking lot, and the fall air hit her, cool and smelling of leaves, and she stood in it for a moment and breathed. Ruth Ann came out behind her. "You did good in there," she said. "We did good," Harper said. "You got the Grangers there. That mattered." Ruth Ann made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite modesty. "Your father would have been in that room too, you know. He'd have been right up there at the front, same as you." Harper looked at the parking lot, at the ordinary concrete and the old oaks at its edge, at the town around them going about its Wednesday business. "I know," she said. She drove back to the lake house and sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing for a while, which she allowed herself because the morning had taken something out of her that she hadn't fully accounted for before going in. Not the speaking. The speaking had felt surprisingly like something she'd been building toward. It was the sitting in the same room as Tanner for 2 hours and keeping herself contained inside the knowledge of what he'd tried to do. That was the thing that had cost her. She made tea, which she didn't particularly want, and sat with it. He called that evening. She almost didn't answer again. And then she did, because there was a part of her that had decided she was going to stop flinching from the conversation she needed to have. "You made your point," he said. His voice was controlled in a way that meant he'd been sitting with his anger long enough to put a surface on it. "I want you to know I don't think it was necessary." "What point did I make?" she said. "Tell me how you understood it." A pause. "You told the board the property wasn't available. Fine, I knew you would eventually. We'll restructure the application. You'll restructure it to remove the Doyle frontage. The project is viable without it. It's less ideal, but viable." She knew this was probably true. She had thought about it. The application's geometry was designed around the full frontage, but large developments were usually structured with contingencies because nothing ever assembled exactly as planned. Removing the Doyle parcel hurt the project, maybe significantly, but it didn't kill it. "And the easements," she said, "on the Granger property and Carol Sweeney's land?" This pause was longer. "Those are a more significant problem." He said it with the flatness of a man stating a fact he doesn't like but can't argue with. "Yes," she said. "They are." "You know what you've done to the project margin," he said. "Without that frontage buffer, the unit count has to drop. The marina becomes a liability. The whole thing is a smaller deal. A smaller deal for you and Cascadia. For everyone involved, there are investors with real money in this. Investors who put money into a deal based on access to property that was never available," Harper said. "That's not my problem, Tanner. That's yours." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. Not the anger, which she could still hear underneath, but the approach. "I'm not your enemy, Harper." "I didn't say you were." "You've been acting like it." "I've been protecting my family's property and making sure the county had accurate information." She kept her voice even. "If that feels like hostility to you, I think that's worth examining." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, short and humorless. "You've gotten very good at that." "At what?" "Saying things that sound reasonable while doing something that isn't." Harper looked at the window, at the dark beyond it, at the faint reflection of the kitchen lamp in the glass. "I learned from someone," she said. He hung up. She sat for a while after that, holding the phone, looking at the reflection in the window. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something more complicated. The specific kind of tired that comes not from exertion, but from being completely, clearly seen by yourself for the first time in a long time and finding the view both better and worse than you expected. The 30 days that followed the hearing had a momentum to them that Harper hadn't anticipated. She'd expected waiting, the passive accumulation of time, while attorneys exchanged documents and planning boards processed paperwork. What she got instead was activity, the conservation easements moving toward finalization, which required document review and site visits from the Blue Ridge Conservancy. The divorce proceedings generating a steady rhythm of filings and responses that Maura Finch handled, but Harper still read carefully, every page. The house itself demanding constant, specific attention of the kind that old houses required, where fixing one thing revealed three others. She'd stopped treating it as temporary. Sometime in the third week after the hearing, without making a conscious decision, she drove to Asheville, picked up the rest of her belongings from the rental apartment, gave notice to her landlord, and brought everything back to the lake. It fit in 2 carloads, which told her something about how little she'd actually been living in that apartment. She'd been camping. She'd been waiting for something to resolve elsewhere so she could figure out where her real life was supposed to go. It was here. She understood that now. She put her books on the shelf in the living room, mixed in with her mother's. She hung 2 of her own pictures on the wall of the bedroom, not replacing the ones that were already there, but adding to them, making the room a little of both of them. She moved her father's chair from the corner of the study, where it had been sitting under a sheet, to the spot by the window he'd always preferred, which she knew because she could see the slight indentation in the old rug where the chair legs had rested for 20 years. Small things, the kinds of things that meant you lived somewhere rather than visited. Lena called on a Tuesday evening in the middle of the 3rd week. "Tell me what's happening with the case." "The hearing is in 10 days, Harper said. She was on the back porch, watching the lake in the last light. Cascadia filed their response to the new easement data. They've revised the application, removed the Doyle property as an anticipated parcel. So they're acknowledging they don't have it. In the application, yes, but they're still arguing the project is viable. Smaller scope, fewer units. They've redrawn the marina footprint to work within the Granger property's easement boundary, which I don't think actually works, but that's for the board to evaluate." "And Tanner?" "He's still attached to the deal. His firm is listed as the originating investment partner." A pause. "Maura says his attorneys have gotten quieter. The last round of divorce filings was thinner than the ones before. She thinks they may be preparing to settle, which means the deal is in trouble." "I think so. The investor group behind Cascadia is commercial real estate money. They need returns on a specific timeline. Every delay is a cost. If the project scope gets cut enough, the margins don't support the capital outlay." Harper paused. Patrick heard from his county contact that 2 of the original investors have pulled out of the deal. Lena was quiet for a moment. "And you feel—" "I don't know how I feel," Harper said honestly. "I feel like I did what needed to be done. I don't feel good about it exactly. There's nothing good about 11 years of marriage ending because your husband was surveying your family's land from the road before he'd even told you it was over." "No," Lena said, "there isn't. But I feel clear, which is different from feeling good. Feeling clear it's something I didn't have 6 months ago." She heard Lena settle somewhere on the other end of the line. "I'm proud of you," Lena said. "I'm going to say that even though I know you're going to say something deflecting." "I'm not going to deflect," Harper said. "I'm going to say thank you." A small pause. "You're different," Lena said. "Probably?" "Good different." "I think so," Harper said. "Ask me again in a year." 3 days before the follow-up hearing, something happened that Harper hadn't anticipated. Presley Marsh called her. Harper was in the hardware store in town, debating between 2 shades of exterior paint. The house needed the north-facing trim repainted before winter, and she'd been going back and forth on whether to match the existing color exactly or shift slightly warmer, when her phone rang with a Charlotte area code she didn't recognize. She answered out of the habit she'd developed of answering unknown numbers, because the last 2 months had taught her that unknown numbers were sometimes important. "Is this Harper?" The voice was younger than she expected, careful in the way of someone who had rehearsed an opening line. "This is Presley Marsh." Harper put down both paint chips. "I know who you are." "I know you do." A pause. "I want to say something to you, and I'm not going to ask you for anything. I want to say it. Harper walked to a quieter section of the store, near the electrical supplies, where there was no one nearby. Okay, she said. I'm not with Tanner anymore. I left 3 weeks ago. That's not why I'm calling. I'm not calling because I want you to think better of me. I just don't want you to think I'm still on his side or whatever. She stopped, started again. I knew about the property, about the plan for the development. I was involved in the early stages, the site assessments, the conversations with Cascadia. I knew what he was trying to do. Harper waited. I didn't know, Presley said slowly, that he was still married in any real way. He told me for almost a year that things had been over between you for a long time, and you were just working out the logistics. I know how that sounds. How does it sound? Harper asked. It sounds like exactly what a man who is lying to two women says to both of them. Her voice went flat on that sentence, the flatness of someone who has arrived at a truth and doesn't enjoy being there. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm not saying what I did wasn't wrong. A breath. You were more real to me after I saw you walk up to that dock than you'd ever been from anything Tanner said about you. He talked about you like you were a problem to be managed. And then you just walked up there and you weren't that at all. Harper stood in the electrical supplies aisle and looked at a row of circuit breakers without seeing them. She didn't know what she felt exactly. Something complicated and human that didn't have a clean name. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you're going back to that hearing in 3 days, and I know what Tanner's attorneys are going to try to argue. They're going to say the property's conservation status is a recent manipulation, that you engineered the easement specifically to obstruct a legitimate business arrangement. They're going to try to make you look like the bad actor. Harper was quiet. There's documentation, Presley said, from the early planning stages. Site visit records, internal communications, correspondence with Cascadia that predates the separation. It would establish that the intent to use your property without your consent was present from the beginning, before any of the legal maneuvering started, before you did anything. Why would you give that to me? A silence. Because he spent a year telling me you were difficult and irrational and couldn't be reasoned with. And then I watched you go into that planning hearing and be the most composed, reasonable person in the room. Another pause. I don't think I owe him anything. Harper thought about Presley and Boots standing on the dock, the way she'd put her hand on Tanner's arm when she saw Harper coming. She thought about the years of a story she'd been given that wasn't true, not because someone had told it to her exactly, but because she'd lived inside a version of her own life that had been curated to keep her from seeing clearly. She thought about the document Presley was describing and what it would mean for the hearing. Send it to my attorney, she said. Her name is Maura Finch. I'll let her know to expect it. A pause. Okay. Then quieter. I'm sorry for the part I played in it. Harper didn't say it's okay because it wasn't, not entirely, and she'd gotten past the habit of saying things were okay when they weren't. She said, "Thank you for calling," and meant it, and hung up. She stood in the hardware store for another minute. Then she picked up the warmer paint chip and went to find someone to mix it. She called Maura on the drive home. Maura listened without interrupting, which was characteristic, and then said, "If what she's describing is what it sounds like, it significantly strengthens our position at the hearing and in the divorce proceedings. Can we use it?" If she provides it voluntarily and it's authenticated, yes. The question is whether she'll follow through. A pause. Women who call their former affair partner's wife to offer help don't always follow through. It's a hard call to make, and an even harder one to act on. I think she will, Harper said. She wasn't entirely sure why she thought that. Something in Presley's voice, the flatness of the sentence about what lying men say. That kind of flatness came from having thought through something for a long time. The documentation arrived in Maura's email inbox the following morning. 12 internal emails from Tanner's firm, 4 site visit reports, and a preliminary LOI, letter of intent, between Doyle Capital Partners and Cascadia Development Group, dated 11 months ago, 9 months before Tanner had moved out of their house. The LOI referenced the Doyle family property by parcel number. It described the acquisition of the parcel as the cornerstone of the project's feasibility. Maura called Harper when she'd reviewed it. "This is significant," she said, which for Maura carried the same weight as Patrick saying that went well. "This establishes that the attempt to occupy and claim the property was part of a planned business strategy, not a spontaneous decision. It also directly contradicts any argument that your conservation work was a response to a legitimate business arrangement. The business arrangement was built on an assumption of access they had no right to assume. Can we submit it at the hearing? As public comment, yes. I'll prepare a summary for the board. A pause. Harper. This also changes the divorce settlement picture considerably. If Tanner structured his business affairs around anticipated access to your trust property, if the company's valuation and the investor commitments were partly based on an asset he didn't own, there are questions about disclosure that Maura, the divorce attorney, is very interested in. How interested? Interested enough that I'd like to schedule a separate call this week about what we're going to ask for in the settlement. The follow-up hearing was on a Friday. Harper drove in from the lake in the thin, early fall morning light, the fog sitting on the water again as it had on the first hearing day. She had Patrick beside her in the car this time, which she was glad of. He was someone who took up a specific and reassuring amount of space, the kind of person who had been doing serious things for a long time and whose presence said so. The hearing room was fuller than before. Word had gotten around. The kind of word that gets around in small counties where a large development proposal touches enough people's property and property-adjacent concerns. There were faces Harper didn't recognize alongside the ones she did. Tom Granger was in the third row. Carol Sweeney had come back, with a thermos of coffee this time and a more settled expression, like a woman who had decided where she stood and was comfortable standing there. Tanner was already seated when Harper arrived. The two suited men from Charlotte were back, but Griffin Hale wasn't the one at the front. Someone new had taken the presentation position, a woman this time, whom Harper took to be a senior attorney from the firm. Tanner had his posture arranged in the way she recognized as his version of confidence. Shoulders square, hands still, face neutral. He looked at Harper once when she came in. His expression told her nothing, which was itself information. Presley was not there. The board reconvened. The Cascadia attorney presented the revised application. Fewer units, adjusted marina, restructured conservation impact analysis. It was a competent presentation. The revised project was genuinely smaller, and the environmental concessions were real, not cosmetic. Harper could see what they'd done. They'd taken the changes forced on them and built the best possible version of a project that could still work without the Doyle parcel and within the new easement constraints. It was a good adjustment. In a different world, in a situation that had started differently and with different people, it might have been something to evaluate on its merits. But the documentation in Maura's folder said what the starting point had actually been. When public comment opened, Harper went to the front again. She stated her name. She told the board that new documentation had been submitted to the record that morning. Maura had filed it electronically before 7, and she summarized what it contained. She read one sentence from the LOI, the sentence that named her family's parcel as the cornerstone of the project's feasibility, and she let the room sit with that sentence for a moment before she moved on. She said that the planning board was being asked to evaluate a project whose original design had been built on anticipated access to property that was never legally available, and that the current revised application was not a good faith correction of that design, but an adaptation made necessary by having been caught. She said she understood the board's job was to evaluate the application in front of them, not the one that had been abandoned, but that the public record now contained information about the applicant's conduct that the board might consider relevant to its assessment of the project's integrity. She was at the front for 9 minutes. She used all 9. When she sat down, the room was doing the same thing it had done at the first hearing, that particular quiet of a shift that hadn't been formally announced. Patrick put his hand briefly on her forearm, which from Patrick was a lot. The Cascadia attorney requested time to respond. Denise Aldrich gave her 10 minutes. The response was professionally constructed and said, in essence, that the LOI was a preliminary internal document reflecting early-stage planning, that it had been superseded by the revised application, and that characterizing it as evidence of misconduct was an overreach. It was a reasonable defense of an unreasonable position. One of the board members, a quiet man in his 60s named Raymond Cook, who had said nothing in the first hearing, raised his hand. "I want to ask the applicant's representative a question," he said. The Cascadia attorney turned toward him. "Of course, at the time this letter of intent was drafted, 11 months ago, had your company or the originating investment partner made any direct contact with the owner of the Doyle parcel regarding acquisition?" The attorney paused, a brief, specific pause. I don't have that information in front of me. It's a yes or no question, Raymond Cook said. He had the manner of a retired teacher, or perhaps a man who'd spent his career asking people to account for things. Did you contact her? Another pause. I'd need to review the communications record. Raymond Cook looked at the board chair. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was made entirely of the accumulated meaning of years of working together. We'll make that a formal information request, Denise Aldrich said. Applicant will provide a full communication record regarding any contact or attempted contact with the Doyle property owner, submitted to the board within 14 days. Griffin Hale, who had been quiet all morning in the second row, leaned toward the suited man beside him and said something very low and very fast. The suited man's face didn't change, but his hands, Harper noticed, had stopped being still. Tanner was looking at the front of the room. She could see his profile from where she sat. He was very still in the way he got very still when the calculation wasn't working out. She had known that stillness for 11 years. She used to try to read it, to figure out what it meant, whether she'd done something wrong or whether he was just tired or whether there was something happening in his business world she didn't know about. She'd spent a tremendous amount of energy over the years trying to decode Tanner's stillness. She wasn't doing that anymore. She looked at his stillness and felt simply the fact of it, without trying to read anything into it, without wondering what her role in it was. She turned back to the front of the room, where the board chair was making a note, and waited for whatever came next. The board's information request landed on Cascadia's attorneys like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward fast and kept going. Harper learned the details in pieces over the following 2 weeks, some from Patrick, some from Maura, some from the particular small-town information network that Ruth Ann Pickett seemed to operate as a public service. The communication record Cascadia submitted to the board was, according to Patrick's county contact, notably thin, a handful of emails that showed early-stage due diligence but conspicuously lacked any documentation of direct outreach to Harper, which was itself an answer to Raymond Cook's question, just not the kind you could say out loud. The absence of contact was the contact. They'd never approached her because approaching her had never been the plan. The plan had been Tanner. 2 of the original investors had already withdrawn before the second hearing. 3 more pulled out in the 10 days that followed it, according to a source Maura wouldn't name, but whose information she clearly trusted. The project didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It deflated, the way things deflate when the air goes out slowly from multiple punctures at once. Units got cut. The marina was shelved. The event center became a footnote in a revised pro forma that nobody with serious money wanted to look at. By the end of the 3rd week after the hearing, Cascadia's project manager had requested a 60-day extension on the application, which in the language of planning boards and development timelines meant the project was on life support, and the people attached to it were trying to decide whether to unplug it or keep paying for electricity. Tanner called Harper once during that period. She answered because she'd made a practice of answering now. I want you to know this wasn't personal, he said. It was the same thing his mother had said from the porch on that first afternoon, in that same flat declarative tone that assumed the listener would find it clarifying. Harper had thought about that phrase many times since. It was the kind of thing people said when they wanted to remove themselves from the consequences of personal decisions, when they wanted the other person to agree that they hadn't really been hurt by something that had very much hurt them. I know you believe that, she said. I'm not sure what that means. It means I understand that from where you were standing, this looked like a business situation. That's exactly the problem. She paused. You looked at my parents' home and saw a transaction. I understand that's not malicious for you. That's just how you see things. He was quiet for a moment. You're going to tell me I don't understand what the place means to you. I'm not going to tell you anything, she said. I don't think it would land. I think you're a certain kind of person, and this is a certain kind of thing, and those 2 facts don't meet. She said it without anger because she didn't feel anger exactly. She felt something more tired and more accurate. I hope the business side of this works out somehow. I genuinely mean that. But I'm not going to let this property be any part of how it works out. Another pause. The divorce settlement, he said. Maura's latest proposal. What about it? It's aggressive. It's accurate, she said. Talk to your attorneys. She hung up and went back to the kitchen table, where she'd been reading through the Blue Ridge Conservancy's draft easement language for the Doyle parcel itself. She'd been talking with them for 3 weeks about putting a formal conservation easement on the lake house property. Not just the shoreline strip, but the full 47 acres. It wasn't a decision she'd made quickly. She'd sat with it, talked it through with Patrick, called Lena one evening, and walked around the property in the dark while they talked, looking at the tree line against the sky. The easement wouldn't limit her use of the property. She could still live here, maintain it, pass it through the family trust. What it would do was permanently restrict any future subdivision or large-scale development, regardless of who held the trust, regardless of what circumstances arose later. It would make the property, legally and permanently, what her father had always intended it to be. A place. Not a parcel. Not a potential transaction. A place that existed for its own reasons and on its own terms. She signed the preliminary easement agreement on a Tuesday morning at the same kitchen table with Patrick beside her and a pot of coffee between them. When she set the pen down, Patrick said, "Your father had this conversation with me once about whether to do something similar. He decided the trust structure was sufficient." He paused. "I think he'd reconsider after this year." "I think he'd have done exactly what I just did," Harper said. Patrick smiled slightly, which on his face was a significant gesture. "I think you're right." The 60-day extension Cascadia had requested came and went without a revised application. In early December, Patrick's contact at the planning office confirmed what had been functionally obvious for weeks. The project had been formally withdrawn. No public statement from Cascadia, no press release, just the administrative notation of a withdrawal filed quietly on a Wednesday afternoon when the county office had 3 other things on its agenda. Tanner's involvement with Doyle Capital Partners also changed in that period, though the specifics took longer to surface. Mora's investigation into the firm's financial disclosures, the information request that had emerged from the divorce proceedings, driven by the LOI documentation Presley had provided, had uncovered what Mora described, in her careful attorney language, as significant questions about how projected returns from the Calder Lake project had been represented to the firm's limited partners. It was the kind of finding that had consequences not in the dramatic, immediate way of a movie, but in the slow, grinding way of regulatory and civil proceedings. Inquiries from investors, questions from accountants, the kind of scrutiny that a firm built on personal reputation could not long sustain. Tanner didn't lose everything at once. That wasn't how it happened. What happened was that certain investors quietly moved their money elsewhere, that certain introductions stopped being made, that the version of Tanner Doyle who entered rooms like he owned them became, over months, a version that entered rooms with more calculation and less certainty, because the room no longer assumed the same things about him when he walked in. Harper knew these things the way you know things that happen at a distance, in outline, through intermediaries, without the details that would make it feel real or specific. She did not take pleasure in it. She'd thought she might, when she let herself imagine the shape of this outcome in the early weeks when everything was still uncertain. But when it actually came, it felt less like satisfaction and more like the particular flatness of a thing being finished. Not a good feeling or a bad feeling, just the feeling of over. The divorce settlement was finalized on a Thursday in February, in Mora's office with the dead plant on the windowsill that had apparently been there long enough to become architectural. Harper signed the papers at the same kind of table she'd been signing things at for months, and Mora handed her a pen that she returned when she was done and didn't keep as a souvenir because she wasn't the kind of person who kept souvenirs of the worst year of her life. Mora walked her out. On the steps of the building, she said, "I want to tell you something, not professionally, just personally." Harper waited. "I've handled a lot of these, difficult ones, where there's money and real estate and people who've been in the business of managing other people for a long time." Mora looked at her directly. "Most people in your position, they come in scared. They stay a little scared through the whole thing, even when they're doing well. You were angry in the beginning, I think, but you weren't scared. That made a difference." "I was scared," Harper said. "I just decided it wasn't the most important thing I was feeling." Mora nodded once, as if that answer satisfied a question she'd been thinking about. Then she went back inside, and Harper stood on the steps in the February cold and looked at the street. She drove back to the lake. Spring came to Calder's Bend the way spring always did. Slowly, then suddenly. March was tentative, cold mornings, occasional warmth in the afternoons, the first green things pushing up at the edges of the yard without any particular confidence. April announced itself more clearly. The lake changed color as the light changed, going from the pewter gray of winter to something warmer, more complicated. The kind of blue that meant the water temperature was shifting, and the fish were moving, and the herons were back on the far bank. Harper painted the north-facing trim in April, on 3 consecutive days when the temperature was right and the forecast was dry. She was better at it than she'd been in the fall, more patient with the edges, less likely to rush. She'd learned that some things just needed to be done slowly or they didn't hold. She'd been making small repairs to the dock all winter, replacing boards as she identified the ones that had gone soft, reseating cleats that had worked loose. She'd done most of it herself, badly at first and then less badly, consulting a neighbor 2 roads over named Dale Rickman, who'd grown up on the lake and knew dock work the way people who grew up near water know dock work, practically, without sentiment. He'd shown her which boards to replace and which ones were fine despite looking weathered, and she'd learned to tell the difference by pressing her thumb against the wood and feeling for the give. Dale had become something like a friend over the winter. He was 68, widowed 4 years ago, with a directness that had nothing to do with rudeness and everything to do with a man who'd decided life was too short for the conversational version of the long way around. He'd shown up one afternoon in November to help her move a section of the dock she couldn't manage alone, and they'd ended up drinking coffee at the kitchen table for 2 hours, talking about the lake, about the history of the properties along this stretch, about the families who'd come and gone. He'd known her parents by sight, her father to speak to. He said her father had been the kind of man who understood the difference between what was yours and what you were taking care of. Harper had written that down later. She did that sometimes, wrote down things people said that landed correctly. She was on the dock on a Saturday in late April, finishing the last section of board replacement, when she heard a car on the gravel. She recognized the sound of it before she looked up, knew the particular way the gray Lexus turned into the drive at a certain speed. She kept working for a moment, finishing the fastener she was driving, setting the drill down. Then she stood up. He was walking toward the dock through the tree line. He was thinner than he'd been in the fall, or maybe just wearing clothes that fit differently. He moved more carefully, she thought, less of the room-entering energy that had always preceded him. She waited at the end of the dock. He stopped at the foot of it. He didn't step onto the boards, which might have been a legal caution. The property was hers, he knew that clearly by now. Or might have been something else. "I should have called," he said. "Yes. I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I've been picking up," she said. He looked at the lake, then at her. The morning light was behind her, and she thought probably she was harder to read from where he was standing. She didn't move to make it easier. "The firm is going through some changes," he said. It was the kind of phrase that covered a large amount of territory. She let him choose how much to offer. "I heard," she said. "It's not—" He stopped, started differently. "I made some decisions that were based on assumptions I shouldn't have made. About this place. About what I was entitled to." He said the word entitled with something in it that cost him, not regret exactly, more the tone of a man reciting a word someone else has used and finding it fits better than he wanted it to. "Yes," she said. "You did." He was quiet for a moment. A boat passed somewhere across the lake, far enough that its sound arrived without the shape of it. He watched the water. "I always knew you cared about this place more than anything I could offer you," he said. "I think I resented it. I think I spent a long time resenting the things about you that I couldn't get my hands on." It was the most honest thing she'd heard him say, possibly in years. She recognized it as honest because it didn't make him look good, and Tanner almost always curated himself toward looking good. This didn't do that. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here because I want something." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "I just thought you deserved to hear me say that I understood what I did." Harper looked at him. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the woman she'd been when she married him. Younger, more willing to mistake intensity for love, more inclined to make herself fit the space someone else defined for her. She thought about the morning she'd driven to this lake in a flannel shirt thinking about olive oil and what had happened to her since. The things she'd had to learn in a hurry. The things she'd had to learn slowly. She didn't feel warmth toward him, and she didn't feel hatred. She felt something quieter and more honest, which was the recognition that people were usually exactly who they were, and that the mistake was not the person, but the decision to build your life around someone you'd mistaken for something different. "I hear you," she said. "I don't need to say I forgive you. That's not the part that matters to me." He nodded, a small motion. "What matters to me," she said, "is that I understand how I got here. Not what you did, what I did, what I kept choosing. That's the part I have to live with and work out." She paused. "You're a chapter in that. An important one. But that's what you are." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he said, "Take care of this place." "I intend to," she said. He turned and walked back through the tree line. She heard the car door. The Lexus reversed out of the drive and the sound of it diminished through the pines. And then it was quiet again, just the lake and the birds and the water moving under the dock in that small, constant way it had. She stood on the end of the dock for a while, not performing anything, not arriving at a conclusion, just standing in the place where she was, in the late April morning, with the work half done behind her and the lake in front of her doing what it had always done, which was simply be itself regardless of what happened around it. She thought about her father. She thought about him sitting at the kitchen table, looking at this same water, thinking whatever he thought about in the mornings. She'd never asked, and now she couldn't, and that gap was one of the things she'd learned to live with rather than around. She thought about what he'd built. Not just the legal architecture of the trust, but the simpler thing underneath it. The conviction that some things were worth protecting at cost, that the measure of a piece of land wasn't its development potential, but its continuity, what it remained through time. She used to think her father's attachment to this place was sentiment. The word Tanner had used, standing on this same dock, before everything surfaced and broke apart. She understood now that sentiment wasn't the weak thing she'd been taught to think it was. Sentiment was what you felt about the things that had made you. You could call it weakness, and you could try to manage people out of it, but you couldn't actually argue against it, because it wasn't an argument. It was a fact about what it meant to be a person who had lived somewhere and loved someone, and carried those facts forward through time. The Blue Ridge Conservancy had formally recorded the Doyle property easement in March. The full 47 acres, the 1,100 feet of shoreline, the upland buffer all the way to the north fence line, permanent restriction on subdivision or large-scale development. The document named Harper as trustee and grantor, and it named the lake, the parcel, the county, the specific section of conservation law under which it operated. It was 22 pages long, and she had read every page. It was, she thought, one of the most important things she'd ever signed, and it was also one of the simplest. It said, in the formal language of property law, that this place would remain what it was. In May, she got a call from the Conservancy's regional director, a woman named Sasha Odom she'd been working with through the winter, who said she wanted to talk about an expansion project they were considering. "We've been in conversation with the County Conservation Board about a connected corridor along the eastern shoreline," Sasha said. "The idea is to link the protected parcels along this stretch into a continuous conservation zone, running from your northern property line down through the Granger easement and Carol Sweeney's land and then to the two existing easements further south. If it works, you'd have about 1.5 miles of protected shoreline in one connected designation." "That's significant," Harper said. "It would essentially make large-scale lakeshore development along this stretch legally implausible for the foreseeable future." A pause. "We'd need your cooperation and your formal support for the corridor application. You wouldn't be required to add any new restrictions beyond what's already in place. We just need the anchor parcel, yours, to be willing to be named as part of the connected system." Harper looked out the kitchen window at the lake. "I'm willing," she said. "Let's talk about what you need." Summer came fully in June. The lake got warm enough to swim in by the 3rd week, which was the usual schedule, and Harper swam most mornings before the day started. Not because she was particularly athletic, but because her father had done it every summer morning she could remember, and some habits were worth inheriting. She wasn't graceful in the water. She'd never been a strong swimmer, tended to go straight across and straight back, no variation. But she went in every morning, and the water was cold enough in the early hour to be clarifying, which was what she needed. Lena came up in July with her daughter Cora, who was 12 and had her mother's directness and her grandmother's eyes. And they stayed a week. Cora spent most of the visit on the dock with a fishing rod, catching mostly nothing but with the focused contentment of someone who had decided the catching wasn't the point. In the evenings, they sat on the back porch, and Lena drank wine and Harper drank tea, and Cora fell asleep in the porch chair before 9 o'clock, and they talked in the low voices adults used around sleeping children, which was a habit that outlasted the need. "You seem like you're here," Lena said one of those evenings. She meant it in the specific sense, present, settled, not elsewhere. "I am," Harper said. "Last year you weren't anywhere. You know what I mean." "I know what you mean." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Do you think about what would have happened if Ruth Ann Pickett hadn't called?" Harper had thought about it. It was the kind of counterfactual that seemed important until you sat with it long enough. "I think something would have brought it to a head eventually," she said. "The development application would have come through channels I'd have heard about. Patrick would have told me something was wrong. I think I was already moving toward this. I just needed something to move me faster." "Tanner moved you faster." "He did." She paused. "He did me the favor of making it impossible to keep pretending." Lena looked at her. "You're not going to give him credit for that." "I'm not giving him credit," Harper said. "I'm just being accurate." After Lena and Cora left, the house was quiet again, in the specific way it went quiet after family. Not empty, but returned to its ordinary scale. Harper found she didn't mind it. She'd learned to mind it less over the months, had found that living alone in a place you actually wanted to be was completely different from living alone in a place you'd landed in by subtraction. She was sitting on the dock on a Saturday evening in late July, just as the light was leaving, when she let herself think about all of it from the beginning. The call on Wednesday morning in Asheville, the drive down, her mother's hat on Meredith's head, the dock, the declaration. "You're not my wife anymore." She'd thought about that sentence many times, mostly in the first months, picking it apart for what it had meant. He'd said it as a dismissal, and it had landed as one, in the moment. But the thing about dismissals was that they worked only if the person being dismissed agreed that the dismisser had the authority to do the dismissing. And Tanner, standing on that dock in his linen shirt with his reading glasses pushed up and his hand near Presley's elbow, had never actually had that authority. He'd assumed it, the way he assumed most things, because no one had stopped him yet, because the people around him had been accommodating his assumptions long enough that he'd mistaken accommodation for agreement. She hadn't agreed. She'd just been quiet about her disagreement for too long. That was the thing Harper had spent the most time with, in the months since everything broke open. Not what Tanner had done, which was legible and, once you saw it, almost simple. A man who wanted something and tried to take it because taking things was what he knew how to do. What she'd spent time with was herself. The version of herself who had bent around his edges for 11 years, who had made herself smaller in rooms where she should have taken up more space, who had looked at the kitchen faucet dripping in her parents' house and understood what her mother meant by company, and then gone home to a marriage that had none of that quality and told herself it was enough. She hadn't been a passive person exactly. That wasn't quite the word. She'd had opinions, and she'd stated them, and she'd held jobs and made decisions, and moved through the world with some version of competence. But there was a specific kind of self-possession she'd given away somewhere in the middle years of the marriage. Not all at once, but gradually. The way you don't notice a slow leak until the thing is empty. The part of herself that knew what she wanted without checking first whether wanting it was going to create a problem. The part that could stand in her parents' kitchen and feel, without qualification, that she belonged there. Tanner had called that sentiment. She'd thought about that word a great deal. The way certain people used it, people who prided themselves on clarity, on practicality, on seeing things as they were rather than as they felt. Sentiment was always a diminishment. Something slightly embarrassing, a weakness dressed up as attachment. But what she understood now, sitting on the end of the dock where everything had started and everything had changed, was that the people who called sentiment a weakness were usually the people who had never built anything worth being sentimental about. Tanner had not built this lake. He had not spent 40 years on this dock watching his children grow. He had not sat at that kitchen table through 2,000 ordinary mornings until the table meant something that couldn't be put in a property filing. He had shown up with a moving truck and a plan and assumed that what other people had built over generations could be converted into a line item in a development pro forma, and he had been wrong. And the reason he had been wrong was not strategic or legal or financial. The reason he had been wrong was simpler than that. Some things are not for taking. Not because they're protected, though they can be protected, but because they carry something that doesn't transfer. You can take the land. You cannot take what the land means to the people who loved it into existence. Harper's father had understood that. He'd understood it well enough to spend money on attorneys and trust documents and legal protections, because he also understood that understanding alone didn't stop people who weren't interested in understanding. You had to build the wall. You had to put the words on paper and file them and make them real in the world where real things operated by their own rules. Love and law. You needed both. Neither one was enough by itself. She looked at the water going dark in the late evening light. A bat was working the air above the dock. She'd been watching bats here since childhood, had been afraid of them at first and then fascinated, had read enough about them eventually to appreciate the precision of what they were doing, the constant invisible geometry of echolocation. Her father had loved bats, had been mildly evangelical about their value, which was one of those things about him that had seemed odd when she was young, and now seemed exactly right. She thought about what she wanted the next years to look like. She'd been thinking about it in fragments for months. Individual pieces without a clear shape. The house. The conservation corridor. The work she might do here, from here, since she'd been doing her consulting work remotely since Asheville and had discovered that it functioned just as well from a kitchen table in Calder's Bend as from an apartment near the river. The people she'd met since coming back, Ruth Ann, the Grangers, Dale Rickman, Carol Sweeney, Sasha Odom at the Conservancy. People who were connected to a specific place in the way she was connected to this one, who understood what it meant to care about somewhere rather than just be somewhere. She thought there might be something in that. Not a plan exactly, more an orientation. A way of spending time that was about the same things her father had spent his time on, just carried forward into different forms. The conservation corridor was one piece. She'd been talking to Sasha about what else might be possible. Educational programs, maybe, something about the ecology of the lake that could bring younger people into the same relationship with the place that her father's generation had had with it. She wasn't sure yet. She was letting it take shape slowly, which was something she was getting better at. Letting things take the time they needed. The bat made another pass over the dock. The water was nearly dark. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called, that long, wavering note that carried in a way that made distance feel different, made the far bank sound both far and close at once. She thought about a conversation she'd had with Dale Rickman the previous month, sitting on his porch after he'd helped her identify which section of the property's tree line needed attention before storm season. He'd been talking about his late wife, who had grown up on this lake the way Harper had. Family property, generations of it. And he said something that had stayed with her. He'd said, "She used to tell me that the lake didn't belong to us. We belonged to the lake. Like the difference was important." He'd paused and looked at the water. Took me a while to understand what she meant. I think I understand it now. Harper understood it too. She thought she'd understood it most of her life without having the words for it, which was why Tanner's version of the place had always felt wrong even when she couldn't articulate why. He'd looked at the property and seen something that belonged to someone. She'd looked at it and understood, in whatever wordless way these things were understood, that the belonging ran the other direction. The conservation easement that bore her name and her signature was, at its core, a legal expression of that same understanding. A document that said, "This place is not a transaction. Its value is not convertible. It will remain what it is because we have decided, in writing, that what it is matters more than what it could become." Her father had pointed her toward that decision without telling her he was pointing her toward it. That was how he did most things, quietly, in advance, trusting her to arrive where he'd been thinking she'd arrive. She'd been frustratingly slow about it, from any objective assessment. She'd married the wrong man and stayed too long and hadn't read the room for years while things moved around her that she should have seen. She had not been, in other words, the heroine of her own story in any clean or efficient way. She'd been a person making ordinary human errors of trust and willful blindness and fear dressed up as patience, and she'd paid for them in the specific currency of time and self-possession and years she couldn't get back. She didn't think that made the ending less true. She'd learned slowly that the value of arriving somewhere wasn't diminished by the fact that you'd taken the long way. The dock was still the dock. The lake was still the lake. She was still here, and she was more herself than she'd been in a long time, maybe more than she'd ever been, and those facts were true regardless of how circuitous the path to them had been. She sat on the dock until the last of the light was gone and the stars came out over the lake one by one, in the way they did out here, away from the town's ambient glow. First a few bright ones, and then more, until the whole sky was doing what the lake did, holding light that had come from somewhere very far away and making it visible. She was not all right in some finished, resolved, permanently repaired sense. She knew better than that. There were mornings still when the weight of the year sat on her chest before she was fully awake, when the grief of the marriage, not grief for Tanner exactly, but grief for the years and the effort and the specific kind of hope you invest in a shared life, arrived without being invited and had to be sat with before it would move on. She was 42 years old and she was starting over in some essential way, which was not the same as starting fresh, because you never started fresh. You started from where you were, carrying what you carried, and you went from there. But going from there was something she knew how to do now. She had the house, and the land, and the signed documents, and the work of the conservation corridor ahead of her. She had Lena's number, and Patrick's number, and Sasha Odom, and Ruth Ann Pickett, and Dale Rickman, and Carol Sweeney, who had sent her a card in April that said simply, "Glad you're there," with a small drawing of a heron that Carol had apparently done herself. She had her mother's lamp in the living room and her father's chair by the study window and the books on the shelf that were both of theirs now, mixed together in the way that things mixed when you lived in a place long enough. She had the faucet dripping in the kitchen, which she still hadn't fixed. She didn't plan to. After a while, she got up from the dock and walked back through the dark yard to the house, navigating the familiar routes and the split in the path by feel. The way she'd been doing since childhood. Her feet remembering the ground the way feet remembered ground they'd known long enough. The kitchen light was on. She'd left it on when she came out, and it made a yellow square in the dark that she walked toward. She went inside. The faucet dripped. The lamp in the living room threw its warm light on the old floor. The house smelled like wood and lake air and the soup she'd made for dinner, which had been nothing special, just what was in the refrigerator assembled into something warm. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. The thing about cruelty, and she'd had time to think about this, long enough to think about it clearly rather than painfully, was that it was often most potent not in what it took, but in what it accidentally returned. Tanner had stood on her parents' dock and told her she wasn't his wife anymore. He'd meant it as a disposal, as a final administrative act in a process that had already concluded in his mind. He'd meant it to free him, which it had. What he hadn't calculated, because he'd never understood the thing he was standing on when he said it, was that it freed her too. Not just from the marriage, but from the particular smallness she'd been practicing inside it. He'd said those words and she'd walked into this house and locked the door, and something had locked back into place inside her that had been loose for a long time. She hadn't known, in that moment, what came next. She'd known only that she was in her parents' house, and it was hers, and she was not going to leave it. Everything else had come from that. She filled a glass of water at the sink, listening to the faucet after she turned it off. The familiar drip, irregular and patient, the same rhythm it had kept through decades of ordinary mornings and difficult ones. Her mother had called it company. She understood now that her mother had been right, and that understanding things your mother was right about, after she was no longer there to tell, was one of the quieter forms of grief and also one of the quieter forms of love. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed in the house that was hers, on the lake that she belonged to, under the same sky her father had looked at every morning when he swam out into the cold water before anyone else was awake, carrying whatever he carried, going from where he was. She slept